I used to work at a Boy Scout summer camp. Every week I had to take a big group of campers to a secluded spot for their wilderness survival badge. They had to build a shelter out of sticks and leaves, that kind of thing. Sleep in it overnight. The spot was only about a half a mile away from the main camp, but we took them a long, scenic route that made it seem really secluded. Anyways, this one night in 2004, all the campers had made their shelters. We had cooked dinner and were all just sitting around the campfire. It was getting late, maybe 11 o'clock, so I sent all the campers to their shelters for the night and started cleaning up around the fire. That's when we heard in the distance what sounded like church bells. They were pretty faint, but myself and the fellow staffers could definitely hear them. They went on for about 30 minutes, ringing every 30 seconds or so. We were all a little creeped out as there were no churches or towns within 20 miles of us. After the bells stopped, though, the singing started. It was too faint to hear the words, but it sounded like church choir music. But from a lot of people, and a lot more enthusiastic. Also, it was almost midnight at this point. The singing went on for well over an hour, sometimes quieting down until we almost couldn't hear it, sometimes getting so loud we thought it was getting closer to us. All of the campers were super creeped out, but I lied to them, telling them there was a church service going on in camp, and that there was nothing to be scared of. Eventually, at almost 1 a.m., the singing stopped. I found out a few days later there had been a large KKK rally only a few miles away that night. I wonder if that's what we heard. I studied abroad in Sweden last year and decided to go on a hiking/camping trip for a week when I didn't have any classes. This was late September of last year. I'm an avid outdoorsman and do stuff like this often, so I wasn't worried about anything too much. I brushed up on the local flora and fauna in my area and set off for a lake close by. It was about a 30-minute bike ride from where I lived, and from there I was going to hike around the lake. I hiked about 8 to 10 miles a day and would set up camp. Everything was going as planned until the third night. I had set up camp in a lightly wooded area that was adjacent to the lake. It was a beautiful spot. I set up a hammock to sleep in, and as I was about to shut my eyes, I started to hear a faint whistling. I decided that it was just the wind blowing through the trees above me. About 10 minutes later, I heard it again, but it was louder. I was in the middle of nowhere and hadn't seen a building or person or any signs of human activity since the day before. I wanted to shoot out and see if someone was there, but instead decided to remain silent and keep listening. The whistling got louder and louder, and I could hear footsteps crouching on branches. It sounded about 100 yards away. I was wondering if they could see my hammock hanging there and if they were coming close, so I pulled out my hunting knife and laid there in silence. When it sounded that they were about 50 yards away, the footsteps stopped. I could hear someone whispering something in Swedish. I can understand a few words when people speak the language, but this was too much for me to keep up with. I didn't hear anything the rest of the night. I just waited for the sun to rise. In the morning, I searched the area to see what I could find, and after about an hour of looking, I couldn't find any evidence that someone had paid me a visit in the middle of the night. It's still one of the strangest experiences I've had. When I was a kid, maybe 10 years old, I went on a camping trip with my dad and what seemed to be, at the time, our entire extended side of his family. We were all gathered in the woods with literally dozens of adults and tents all gathered around one huge bonfire. Looking back, maybe it wasn't the smartest idea to have a bonfire in the woods, but anyways, it gets really late and all of the adults around the fire are very drunk and not paying attention to us kids at all. I go walking on the trail with my cousin who's around my age. The thing you have to understand about me is that I've lost most of my hearing. Even back then, I could understand most talking, but softer noises are often lost on me. Anyways, back to the story. We're walking and chatting, and at some point my cousin gets really quiet. He keeps looking over his shoulder and jumps at everything. I ask him what's wrong, and he says he can hear something moving in the woods. We're pretty far away from the camp at this point. I can't even see the glow from the bonfire anymore. If I look over my shoulder, I can't hear anything moving in the trees myself, but being partially deaf, I'm forced to rely on his sense of hearing. We keep walking on the trail because we're idiots, and he stops talking entirely. At some point, he stops and looks over his shoulder, and his face just chills me to the bone. He starts crying and asks very loudly, "Mom?" He then proceeds to scream her name and just bolts for the camp. He's completely out of my sight, not that that's hard to do in total darkness, admittedly, before I can even say anything. At that point, I start walking back to camp. I didn't want to run in total darkness, even on a trail. Maybe it was the fact that I was alone now, but I started to become more and more afraid as I walked, and I felt like I wasn't alone. I'm just able to see the glow from the bonfire when I hear a snap or crack behind me. Being as deaf as I am, something has to be really loud for me to hear it like that. I about wet myself and ran the rest of the way to camp. When I got there, my cousin is sitting in my mom's lap just sobbing. I got in trouble with my dad for going down the trail without an adult. The creepiest part was, the next day, I asked my cousin what happened. He said someone whispered in his ear that his mom was dead. My tale takes place a few weeks back while I was camping in the bush of Australia. This was my first break in several months from work, and I'm a roadie for international bands like Pink, Nickelback, etc. I decided to go camping with two old mates up in the bush for a few days, far away from the world as possible. I'm an experienced bushman and camped in the bush many a times over the years. We heard about a place way out at the back of a small town. It was at the back of Mount Lindsay. The locals call it Yowie country. A Yowie is basically the Australian equivalent of a Bigfoot, an aboriginal mystic creature like the bunyip. So just before the town is the gateway to a national park. After a few hours of driving, we finally found the old road that led to our purposed camping site. It was located on an old logging trail. Not many people, in fact no one, goes out there anymore, which made it better for both of us. We left the truck 5 miles from where we camped and made our way up through the dense forest along the barely recognizable track, avoiding snakes and jumping ants. Yes, we've got ants that jump and attach themselves to your privates and sting the bloody hell out of you. It took about 20 minutes to set up the site, trample over the branches to prevent rain from wetting us, and We were in a drought, but old habits are hard to break. We made a pit to bury our beer in and keep it cool, and a decent fire pit. We gathered wood and twigs. We were ready for a good night of playing cards and drinking beer and talking about the best routes we've had. You know, the usual BS. The night was clear as I remember, and hot. No moon, but the stars were like little eyes peering down at us. Maybe they were. I had to go drain the old lizard, so I stumbled off with a torch into the bush and kept hearing my friend calling out saying, "Beware of the Boogeyman." But I was more concerned about the death adders and brown snakes. As I was doing my business and gazing at the stars, a strange and horrible smell like something rotten overwhelmed me. I stumbled back, gagging, but as I was stumbling back to the campsite, I thought I heard a deep growl, like when your stomach rumbles when you've had nothing to eat, but way louder. The hairs on the back of my neck rose as I quickly hurried back to the site. I told the others, but they said it might have been some animal, so we just went back to our card playing. It was 11:45 by now, and I was dead beat. I had my sleeping bag already unrolled and crawled in after saying goodnight to the other two and slid into the bag. It wasn't long before I was passed out. I don't know how long I was asleep, but the three of us were suddenly woken by the strangest, spookiest, loudest piercing scream that I've ever heard. It was not human. It was inhuman. We sat up and looked at each other when we heard the loud crashing coming through our campsite, like a bulldozer rampaging through the bush. Whatever the hell it was big. Then I saw it. Something massive, well built, coming crashing through the forest. I couldn't make out the details, but it looked strangely like a human, or better yet, a gorilla. The smell will haunt me to the end of my days. It was that rotting stench like a corpse. This thing stood over 7 feet tall, and as it came tearing through the campsite, it just as quickly vanished into the night. We all jumped up, gibbering like madmen at what we just witnessed. Was this just some hippie that smoked some potent weed? No, it couldn't have been too tall and too well built to be some crazed hippie. I tell you this, none of us slept that night. I had the hatchet ready, while one of my mates had a huge branch. The other, I don't know what he had, but we waited until dawn popped its head over the ridge before we left. What we saw in the daylight frightened the Christ out of us. The small saplings were all bent back and snapped. Some of our gear was trampled beyond repair, but we were shaken and stirred by our experience and drove back into town. We didn't tell the locals about what we saw or heard just in case they thought we were nuts. I did find out, though, that a few weeks after we saw this, someone else had the same experience a few miles from where we were. I don't know what we saw exactly, but I'm pretty put off from camping up there. Maybe the old locals are right when they say that Yowies exist in that region. This happened in Scotland in July 2004. 5 of us, 16-year-olds, out camping in the woods. I was the youngest and had only had 2 bottles of cider. Around 2 a.m., being rowdy within a residential area, the police came. We ran off in different directions. I was left with one other friend. I suggested we try and find the rest of our party at the campsite. We arrived at camp, but no one was there. I suggested that I stay at the tents while my friend headed out to find our other friends. He agreed, but said he'd only be away a maximum of 30 minutes to avoid leaving me there alone too long. I tried to get some sleep, but before dozing off, I hear a very clear, softly spoken voice which said to go home. I look around, but there was no one here. After searching the area with a force, I shrugged this off as a possible dream and tried to go back to sleep. A couple of minutes passed, and I hear it again. This time the voice was shouting very loud in my ear, "Go home! Go home now!" I also felt an overpowering presence on top of me, pinning my shoulders to the ground. I could not see anyone though. After about 5 times of repeating itself, I shouted, "Okay, okay, I'll go." It immediately stopped. I grabbed my things and left the site in a hurry, and I went home. My friend who had left did catch up with my other friends, and they headed back to the tents around 15 minutes later. They said they arrived to find the tents on fire. They were terrified at first, thinking I was still in one of them. They managed to put it out, finding only burnt money and sleeping bags. None of us had anything flammable or smoke or anything. Not even equipment to start a fire if we wanted to. My dad and I found a dead camper in Yellowstone when I was 5 or 6. We were walking, throwing stones into a lake. It was like every feel-good vacation movie you've ever seen. Then we saw this guy slumped against a tree. At first we didn't think much of it, but it was getting cold and dark, and my dad didn't want the guy to fall asleep and wake up unable to find his way back to camp. So my dad and I started walking towards him. But the closer it got, the worse it smelt. Not like rotting flesh, but like shit. Literally. My dad told me to stay back, and we walked over to the guy and asked him if he was okay. No response. He asked again. No response. My dad then tapped the guy's shoulder, and the body made a sort of crunching noise as it fell slightly to the side. When this happened, the guy's hat fell off. Because of the way the guy had been slanted, it was like all the blood had gone out half of the guy's face and pooled on the other side. One eye was completely red, possibly from a burst blood vessel. My dad rushed over to me and took me back to the camp ranger's fort place. He had me stay with some nice lady who I remembered looking distinctly like Big Bird, while he led another ranger and a paramedic to the body. It wasn't a horrifying, "oh my god, I got attacked by a bear" type scenario, but it was pretty scary being in a secluded area, far away from home, so young, and finding a dead body. I just want to share an experience I had about 2 years ago in the Sequoia National Forest. My sister took my friend and I out there, and we were deep in the woods, far away from civilization. We were having a great time, and I'm a believer in the paranormal, Bigfoot, aliens, and all that stuff, but while I was there, I never had the thought of any of these things. I was just camping with my family and having a great time. It was about 9 o'clock. Everyone decides to go to sleep, and my friend and I were left staring at the bonfire. I decided it was a good time to listen to music, so I went to my older sister's 4Runner and was opening the back to grab my iPod. As I opened the back door, I heard something come out of the trees. Well, it didn't come out of the trees. It was almost like it was holding on and let go. I heard this huge thump, and I could feel it. And as I had a flashlight on me, I looked over to the trees. I heard the fall, and I swear on my life, I swear to God, I saw what looked to be a 6 to 7 foot insect-like creature. It looked like a praying mantis. As I laid my eyes on it, I completely lost my breath. I was completely taken aback. It took a step back and became completely invisible. I could not believe what I had just seen. I slammed the door and I ran back to the campfire. I alerted my friend and woke up everyone, and no one would believe me. I was really upset because I knew what I'd seen. My friend didn't even believe me. He was laughing at me, and then all of a sudden I could hear all these things surrounding us. And finally, when I brought it to my friend's attention, he kind of put his ear to it and he heard it too. I patrolled the campground with my flashlight and felt like I could just hear these things surrounding us. And I could hear this weird clicking sound. It was really strange. I was terrified, but luckily I had never seen the creature again. Hey everybody, thanks for watching today's video. I hope you really enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to subscribe if you're new to the channel, and make sure to hit that like button. It's one of the most important things you can do to support the channel. It helps a lot. I'll be back real soon with another video for everybody. Until then, stay tuned.